Behold, it is 1887 and the French have developed smokeless powder for their new rifle, the Lebel model of 1887. The Germans at this time, the mortal enemy of the French at this point in history, immediately panic and put together a commission headed by one Otto Schlegelmilch to develop the rifle you see before you, the Gewehr 88 Commission Rifle. It is developed with a Mannlicher-style magazine feeding 5 rounds of 8x57mm Mauser round nose from an en-bloc clip. I'll talk a little bit more about the commission rifle's development and life later on, but first let's talk about the work I had to do to get this one up and running. Starting towards the rear, this entire rear sight base was missing. The bedding in the stock was failed, and I had to repair that. And the barrel was completely roached out and destroyed. There was no rifling. This entire sight base had disappeared. I don't know what happened to it. People say that, because this is common on their Vetterlis as well, that it's some crazy Ethiopian modification. But this is common on the South American rifles that come in, the Gewehr 88s as well, with it missing. I suspect this is really just poor storing conditions allowing the solder to rot and decay off. You can tell by the blobs there, my solder job wasn't great, but it's good enough for a rifle. I likely won't shoot that much. Then I found this sight slider locally. These tend to be very hard to come by. They're virtually unobtainable if they're not already on the rifle. So that was very nice. Additionally, we can tell by the top notch that that is the original round nose sight and not the updated one for Spitzer ammunition. It's a little off, but it doesn't matter. As you can tell, it has the S mark, so the chamber was originally reamed for Spitzer ammunition. An important point about that Spitzer ammunition. The S mark does not indicate your rifle is safe for Spitzer ammunition. It only indicates that the throat of the barrel was reamed such that it could be chambered. Originally, the German Spitzer ammunition was a 321 diameter bullet, and that could be forced into the 318 diameter grooves of the barrel. If your rifle has an S mark, that merely means you can chamber modern Spitzer ammunition. The mark you really want to see is a Z, which indicates deepened grooves to .323, which means you can shoot modern Spitzer ammunition. Even in that event, you should always slug your barrel. There are 3 kinds of barrels you can find on these rifles. The original .318, the later .323, which is common on Turkish rifles as well, but then finally a .316 found on the South American rifles, which was to them barrels by the Czechs. Now these barrels were built for the 316 commercial sporting ammunition. They are identified by a Z in a circle typically. It's supposed to be a Z and a C, but you can't see that. If you see that, it is a 316 barrel. Always slug your bores before you shoot. Now, of course, after World War I, Germany was required to get rid of a lot of its arms and shrink its military, and so what are you going to get rid of? The dud rifles you don't really need. These would be purchased by surplus dealers or sent to other countries. Typically, those 2 things in succession, and that is how the rifle we have today found its way on down to Ethiopia. The pinion you see here on this band was from where it was hammered on to the stock that came with this rifle, which was handmade. We see here the stamping on the receiver is a rack number for 217. This is very common on these rifles. Many Gewehr 88s and Berthiers that have this writing have a rack number stamp. There are also stampings on the shroud. The top row says Beersgan Dem, presumably meaning this rifle under the military rule of, and the bottom being Abalincha Sim, or C, which is presumably the lieutenant or otherwise officer this rifle served under. This naming schema is very common amongst the Ethiopian rifles, as stated previously, found in other Gewehr 88s as well as Berthiers, and in some cases older Enfields. To elaborate more on the other repairs I did, the sight was simple: solder on, call it a day. The stock was repaired by pouring liquid original acrylic glass into both cracks behind the bedding, in the trigger guard area, and behind the rear pillar to glue that all together. Then the receiver was glass bedded to ensure that it was well mounted and minimize cracking, particularly behind the tang. The barrel was another story. Because the Commission Rifle 88 threads, barrel threads, are actually just small ring Mauser threads, I was able to take a Turkish Mauser barrel, which also has small ring Mauser threads, and merely have some of the chamber and muzzle dimensions turned down so it would fit under the shroud. Thus I have a decent .323 Spitzer barrel with good rifling that's ready to be shot in this rifle. Now, this stock has a problem. Failed bedding here, here, and here. Now this isn't good, as the continual of the receiver tang beating into the rear of the stock there will induce it to split like a splitting ball. The solution I plan for this is to glass bed the receiver and hopefully minimize some of that. I'll cover the screw hole with clay, the trigger hole with clay, and those holes with clay as well. This will prevent any sort of mechanical lock from the brown nails acroglass to hold it. The clay I used was just a generic modeling clay. I don't need much, but the problem is if you don't do this, then the acroglass will seep into those holes and hold it mechanically like a dovetail. This will mean that it's actually stuck instead of just sticking to the metal. Now that I've filled the rear pillar with clay, I'll use this release agent to make sure that the receiver doesn't stick to anything. If you don't have a release agent, you can use clear kiwi shoe polish, which should work just as well or better, depending on who you ask. Before I do that though, I'm going to wipe down the receiver with acetone to remove any oils or grime so that the release agent adheres properly to the receiver and not to the acroglass. And now begins the application of the release agent. It's important to be more liberal than a California senator on all this. You have plenty of it and it goes a long way, so there's no reason to use it sparingly. Any spots where you miss, it will stick, and if it sticks too much, you'll have to resort to some questionable methods to get it removed. And now we take the magic goo and stir it up and spread it around to make sure every single nook and cranny is covered. I chose black as a dye because wood grain is black, and it means when you use black, it stands out less. It's harder to see. When doing something like this, it's important to be liberal. You'll have squeeze out, but squeeze out can be removed. If you don't use enough, you may have screwed up the whole thing, and you might need to redo your work. And in she goes. Now I used a combination of rubber bands to get more even pressure, but I also used squeeze clamps to really make sure that the receiver is cinched down tight so that a good impression was made. Upon the acroglass curing, I found that the receiver was a little stuck. However, after turning the rifle upside down and giving a couple spots in the receiver a good nice couple taps with a brass punch and a rubber mallet, out it came, without much fuss or hassle. Next, I took a chisel to slice out some of the chunks of softer acroglass so that the area for the trigger would have more space and could function properly. Once the acroglass cured fully, I used a chisel to cut away any squeeze out so that it would be a nice, clean look on the outside when everything was installed. Now the area where the trigger goes proved to be a larger challenge with a lot more acroglass there. So I decided to do the evil and most terrifying thing to collectors. I pulled out a Dremel tool and went to town. And now it's time to put on the barrel. A struggle common for putting on barrels is the barrel spinning in the vise no matter how hard you clamp it. To avoid this problem, I use baseball rosin. simply coat both the blocks and the barrel shank that you intend to clamp in it, and this helps prevent that rotation and allows you to get the barrel torqued on tightly. Now my barrel vise setup is, I think, different from most people. I don't actually have a good bench. I work off the top of a toolbox most of the time. So when I have to do something like this, I take 2 C-clamps and clamp it down to my hydraulic press that I have outside. Now, when you use this wheeler style barrel vise with oak bushings, unlike those who might use a pipe vise where you just get it pretty tight and that's good enough, when using the oak bushings, you need to get it tight and get it tighter and then still crank it down tighter than before. You really need to crank it down, otherwise the barrel will spin guaranteed. Now to install the barrel, I will use grease on the receiver threads and grease on the barrel threads, being careful to not get any on the oak bushings. I do this for 2 reasons. One, for lubrication and ease of movement. But also what people don't understand is most torque is measured dry unless otherwise indicated, because lubricants reduce the friction of the threads and allow for a higher torque spec. So by lubricating the threads, I am both ensuring they don't corrode, making it easier on myself to tighten, and making sure I can get the maximum torque I can with the setup that I have. Now that begs the question, what torque am I aiming for? Well, because it's a German rifle, I like to go for the German spec of torque. Good and tight. Pay attention to the way I mount the action wrench. I'm mounting it on the feed ramps. When torquing on or off a receiver of a commission rifle, always use the feed ramps. If you use the recoil lug, you will not get enough torque and you will round it over. Ask me how I know. You don't necessarily need the action wrench to be tight, only tight enough that you don't cam over, round over, or otherwise fall off of the surface you are using to apply torque. In my case, the feed ramp. If you're working with something like a Mauser that has a smaller recoil lug that you would torque on, you may need to have your action wrench a little tighter than mine. Not tightening it merely provides the convenience that once you are no longer tightening it, you can merely loosen the screws by hand and take the action wrench off. Now comes assembly. I made a couple mistakes putting this thing together, mostly because I was in a rush and not paying attention. For any aspiring firearms repair enthusiasts, always remember to install your trigger before you put the barreled action in the stock. Otherwise, the commission rifle is fairly simple to put together. There's nothing really terribly tricky about it, and I had already had the bolt assembled anyway. now it's time to shoot. I'm using the Greek surplus 8mm Mauser as it's all I have available for the time being. I would have preferred to get some Cellier and below, and yes, it's Cellier and below, not Cellier and Bellet. I would have preferred to have some of that, but it wasn't available. I had some troubles here. I'm not sure if it's that the rifle is light striking, or that the primers aren't firing very well. I've heard that this Greek ammo does have a tendency to need 1 or 2 strikes to really fire properly. It's also worth noting that I have reproduction commission rifle clips, and the ones I had to take the front bent out areas and flatten them out a little bit so they would feed properly and not put too much pressure on the cartridges and not fall free of the receiver. The brass looks good here. I don't see any cracks near the rear indicative of very open head space, nor does it look like the shoulders have really walked. I don't have an 8mm Mauser field or no-go gauge to test this with, and I probably should have. But either way, it seems like no harm, no foul. I believe some of these feeding issues are due to the fact that the Spitzer cartridge is longer than the round nose. If the cartridges were shorter, it probably would feed better. Such is the ways of using ammo not necessarily intended for the original gun. This project has really been a long time coming. I bought the rifle from Loyal Tiger Imports, probably coming up on 2 or 3 years ago now by this point, and it's really just taken me that long to find a barrel. It's very difficult to find correct commission rifle barrels in the .323 size, so I wound up just having to compromise and use that Turkish Mauser barrel. Anyway, that's about all I have. I have another project coming up soon, but for the time being, thank you for watching.